Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a video on the managing of DHCP. In this video, I'll go over some of the maintenance tasks involved with managing a DHCP server. These include server configuration tasks such as adding and removing bindings, finding and moving the location of our DHCP database, backup and restoring our database, managing the DHCP server service itself, and take a look at some of the DHCP permissions. Then we'll take a look at some of the IPv4 configuration tasks, which include looking at statistics, scope reconciliation, audit logging, conflict detection. We'll look at how DHCP integrates with other networking services such as DNS or NAP. And we'll take a brief look at some of the performance counters that are available on a DHCP server. Now, before we get started, I'd like to mention that there's a certain reality that in most network environments, there's very little that goes into the managing of a DHCP server. This is one of the cool things about this technology. For the most part, just set it up, pretty much runs itself. But then there are those unusual circumstances that do seem to come up, and understanding some of these common maintenance tasks should help you to deal with those situations when they arise. So let's go take a look at the DHCP server. For this demonstration, I'm going to go ahead and connect to New York Member 1. This is the Server 2008 computer, which we set up as a DHCP server in the last video. So I'm going to go ahead and connect to that now. Okay, here we're logged into New York Member 1. What I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Start, Administrative Tools, and select DHCP. This will open up the DHCP console so we can get in here and manage it. Now, the first thing that I want to go over, the first set of items I want to go over, are things that are directly related to the server itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on the server, and the first thing I'd like to show you is this selection right here which says Add Remove Bindings. I'm going to click on it, and it opens up a window which will show us all of the network connections or all of the networks that this server is connected to. This gives us the opportunity to let the server know which networks we want to provide DHCP services to. And in this example, I am connected to two networks, the 10 network and the 11 network. And I have decided that this DHCP server is here to serve the 10 network, but to not serve the 11 network. That's why there's not a check in the box. If I wanted to serve both networks, just add a check to the box and we're on our way. Now, I don't want to do this right now, so I'm going to clear that checkbox back out and click OK. Now, the next thing I want to show you is how we determine the location of our DHCP database. In other words, exactly where on the hard drive is the database stored. So again, I'm going to right click on the server and go down here to where it says Properties. In the property sheet, we see two items. We see the location of the database itself and the location where the backup is stored. Now, we'll talk about backup in just a few minutes. But for right now, you'll see we have highlighted here the location of our database. I'm going to actually hit Control-C on the keyboard. What that's going to do is that's going to make a copy of this path. And the reason why is because I'm going to click on Start. And in the Start search window here, I'm going to hit Control-V to paste that location and then hit Enter. And this opens up that actual location on the hard drive. And it's in here that you'll see there are a number of files. Right here, dhcp.mdb is the actual database file itself. Many of these files you see from here to here, DHCP server log, are logs that are created as part of the audit log. That is something else we'll look at in a little bit. And the rest of these files are supporting files to the database itself. Now you'll notice there's also a backup folder here, and in the backup folder, in the new folder, you'll see that there is another dhcp.mdb, and we'll take a look at that in just a moment here when we talk about DHCP backup and recovery. Let me close this window. Alright, coming back to here, if we would like to move the DHCP database to another location, or I suppose, and or the backup path as well, all we would have to do is click on Browse. It gives you a little warning here that changing the path might result in a loss of data, just to make sure that you know what you're doing. Click Yes. And I could now browse my computer to any other location that I wanted to store the DHCP database. Now, I will tell you that although this can be done, it is common practice to just simply leave it alone. So let me go ahead and cancel out of here. Now, the next thing we want to take a look at is backing up and restoring of our database. So if I right click again on our server, you'll notice there is a selection for backup and restore. Now, before I get into showing you any of that, let me tell you, the DHCP server automatically backs itself up once an hour. That's the reason why we saw that backup folder. That's the reason why we saw an additional dhcp.mdb file. This is something that happens without any intervention from an administrator whatsoever. And it also essentially restores itself automatically if it incurs a failure. When the DHCP server attempts to first launch the database, when it first begins to start the DHCP service, it attempts to open up that database. If the original database is unable to be opened, it automatically will go to the backup location and attempt to open that database. So all of this pretty much happens automatically for you, but if you feel the need to create a manual backup, and an example of where you may want to do that is, let's say you make some kind of dramatic changes to the database into the configuration, and you don't even want to risk waiting that hour for it to be backed up. At that point, you could then click on backup, and you'll select the location where you want it to be backed up to. It defaults to that original backup location. You could select somewhere else, and this is another example of why you may want to create a manual backup. As for instance, you may not back up with your evening backups. When you actually send data to a tape drive at night, like most companies do, you may not be backing up the system root folder. So this is an example where I may want to go ahead and let's do this now. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to actually, right on the root of my C drive, I'm going to create a new folder, and we'll just call it DHCP backup. And then we will go ahead and click OK, and boom, we've created a backup in that folder. Now, just to see that this is true, I'm going to click on Start, Computer, and let's look at our C drive and our DHCP backup folder. And again, you see it creates that new folder, and it put a copy of the DHCP database. So that's how you could create a manual backup. And again, one of the most common reasons for this would be either if you made some dramatic changes, or if you wanted to store it in an alternate location that would then be sent to tape when you did your regular nightly backups. Now, likewise, you could do a manual restore. If for some reason the DHCP server is either unable to find the original or open the original, and it's unable to open up the predefined backup, you could again manually restore by clicking restore and then picking the location that you want to restore from. So I'm going to go ahead and again on our C drive, click DHCP backup, click OK. Now it's going to give you a warning here. It's going to say, in order for changes to take effect, service must be stopped and restarted. Would you like to do this now? Sure. This is just for the obvious reason that you can't overwrite a database while it's running. So what the system is doing is it's shutting down the database, and then it's going to restore the database from backup, and then it will start the services all over again. A real common occurrence where you may have to do a manual restore would be if you completely lost your DHCP server. If it completely failed on you and you've now had to rebuild your server, and you hopefully have made a backup that you did send to tape, you could then recover that data from tape and then do a manual restore to get everything back up and running on your DHCP server. Now, speaking of the DHCP services, that's another thing that we can manage right here from the DHCP console. What I'm going to do is I'm going to right click again on our server, and this time I'm going to put the cursor over where it says all tasks, and you'll see another little menu pops out, and this is where we have the ability to manually stop, start, or you can do it in one shot. You can restart the services. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the DHCP service. And here again we see the little clock, and the DHCP service has been stopped. You'll notice I get the big red circle with the X in it saying I cannot find the DHCP server, and that's because there's not one running. So let's right click, all tasks, and start. And this will bring our DHCP services back up and running once again. And there we go. Everything's back in place. The other thing I want to take a look at here is I want to show you on a DHCP server itself. If you look at your local users and groups, and in order to do this, we need to go to the Server Manager. So I'm going to click on Start and select Server Manager. Once in Server Manager, I'm going to expand Configuration and select Local Users and Groups. And actually, I will expand Local Users and Groups and select Groups. You will see that there are 2 additional groups that you wouldn't find on other servers unless they have the DHCP server service installed. And these 2 groups are DHCP administrators and users. And this is pretty much what it says right here. Let me go ahead and expand this so we can see it. A little bit more. There we go. DHCP administrators, members of this group, have a full administrative access to the DHCP service. So if there is somebody who you want to delegate out the managing of a DHCP server, you may want to make them a member of the DHCP administrators group. Now the other group we have here is DHCP users. Members of this group have view-only access to the DHCP service, so this is probably less common to have somebody be a member of this group. This would be somebody who you want to maybe keep an eye on things, but then would have to notify another administrator if a change had to be made. So these are a couple of the groups that are available on a DHCP server that you won't find anywhere else. So now let's look at some of the tasks that, well, they're still server maintenance tasks, but they're more specific and can be broken out to IP version 4 versus IP version 6. So I'm going to click on IPv4, and then I'm going to right click on it. And the first thing I want to show you here is where it says Display Statistics. So I'm going to select that. This opens up a small little statistic window that I personally have found to be quite handy. What this shows you is just basic communication with the DHCP server. Right here, you can see that it will show me how many discovers, offers, requests, and acknowledgments. You may remember from the last video, that's the 4-step DORA process. Below that, we see NACs, which is what's known as a negative acknowledgement, which is where a DHCP server refuses a request made by a client. And then we have declines, which is where you have a client specifically refusing an offer from a DHCP server. And here we have releases, which would be where a client specifically has gone to the DHCP server and says, I want to release this IP address, I want to release this lease back to you. Now we have some extra information in here about how many scopes we have, how many addresses, how many are in use and available. You'll also see over here where it shows the time that we started and how long we've been up. Now you'll notice that the uptime for this particular server has been a very short period of time. I had just recently brought this server back online, which would also explain why all the numbers show up as pretty much 0 right now. Now, one of the things that you want to look for here, this is where it has come in real handy for me, is if you have a client that it says it's having difficulty communicating with a DHCP server, and it just doesn't seem to be getting its IP address from the server. Well, this is a great place that you can come to the server and look to see if it's even being queried, if it's even hearing the discover. Or maybe you'll see the discovers and the offers, you'll see that number growing, but the requests and the acknowledgments are not growing. Well, this could be where you have a client who's yelling out, hey, I need help, and you have this server saying, here you go, but then for some reason, the client's not coming back and making a request of this server. Could be a communication breakdown, could be that the client is hearing from another DHCP server and it's attempting to communicate with it. So you might have to go out there and find another DHCP server. Another key thing to look for is if you see a large number of NACs or negative acknowledgments. That means there's a lot of clients that are coming in making requests that you won't honor either because the IP address is in use somewhere else or because this client is maybe coming in from the wrong network. So this is just kind of a nifty little thing that you can look at to kind of get a quick overview of what's going on with your DHCP server. So let me go ahead and click on close. Now, before I go on with IPv4, the next thing I want to show you is if I click on a scope and right click, I can also display the statistics there. But in this case, you're going to get an amazingly simple screen that just simply shows how many do I have, how many are being used, and how many do I have available. So I'm going to go ahead and close that window. And let's go ahead and go back up to IPv4. And the next thing I want to show you is, let me right click right here where it says reconcile all scopes. Scope reconciliation is pretty much a process where the system will look at entries that are in the registry of the server and compare it against entries that are in the actual database itself. Sometimes these things can get out of line with one another. Now, if I were to click on verify right now, I get a message saying the database is consistent. So this shows me that all of my databases and my registry are completely consistent with one another. Now, what I want to do is under my 192.168.10 scope, I'm going to click on address leases. And what I want you to see here is that there's a number of leases that have been given out. And the reason is because I had a few different people around my network here just connect to the DHCP server and get an IP address from me just for the sake of demonstrating this. And so what I'm going to do is, this is not necessarily something that would be done in a production environment, but just to demonstrate something getting out of synchronization with one another. I'm going to go ahead and click on Gosha's laptop here. I'm going to right click and delete it. Are you sure? Yes. Now, if I quickly pop back over to IP version 4, right click, reconcile all scopes, and click verify, you will see that it will demonstrate that there's one IP address that's not synchronized. So I can choose to go ahead and reconcile. What it does is takes that particular discrepancy between the registry and the database and it reconciles it. It brings it together to make it consistent. Now if I click on verify again, you will see that everything is now consistent. I'll click OK, click on cancel, and you'll notice if I come back to address leases, that 192.168.1 for Gosha's computer is no longer there. Basically what I did was I eliminated it, which gets registered in the registry immediately, but takes some time before it gets updated on the database itself. So what you can't see and what took place behind the scenes there is the database actually eliminated that record. Now the next thing I want to show you with regards to reconciliation is I want to right click on the scope itself and show you that this can be done on a scope by scope basis, as opposed to when we clicked on IPv4, you were reconciling all scopes. Okay, so that's scope reconciliation. Now the next thing we want to take a look at is, well, let me go to the, right click on the IPv4 and go to the properties. There's a number of things I want to show you here in the property sheet. The first thing is on the General tab, you'll see there's a checkbox for the enabling of DHCP audit logging. Now, this is a simple checkbox just saying, do I want to audit or do I not want to audit? You may recall that when we went and looked at the DHCP folder in the system root, we saw a bunch of log files. That's because the box is checked for DHCP audit logging. If I were to jump to the Advanced tab, you will see that it's right here that we can enter an audit log file path, and it defaults to the system root DHCP folder, and that's why we saw the audit log files there. If I want to store those logs somewhere else, again, maybe this folder's not being backed up at night, maybe you want your logs backed up, I could go ahead and click on Browse and select another location. Now there will be an audit log file created for each day of the week. So there's really no other maintenance when it comes to audit logs. You don't specify any given period of time that you want to do this. It will automatically keep a log file for Monday, another for Tuesday, another for Wednesday, etc., etc. And it will keep that log file for 7 days. In other words, the Monday file will be overwritten when the next Monday file needs to be created. Now, another thing I want to show you right here on this Advanced tab is right here where it says Conflict Detection Attempts. And here you'll notice it's set to 0. That is the default. The default is that there is no conflict detection on a DHCP server. For the most part, it's not necessary. But if I wanted to put a number in there, what the DHCP server would do is every time right before it gives out an IP address, it would attempt to see if that IP address already exists on the network. And it does so by just simply pinging that IP address. So if I said to go ahead and do, let's say, 1 conflict detection attempt, every time this DHCP server was going to hand out an IP address, the first thing it would do is it would ping that IP address to see if it gets a response. If it does get a response, then it would move on to a different IP address to give out to the client. If it does not receive a response to that ping, it says, all right, this IP address is not in use, there is no conflict, I'll go ahead and give it out. Now, this might sound like something which could come in really handy and help prevent all kinds of IP address conflicts that we have out there, but in reality, it's just not necessary, and what this will do is it'll delay the process of handing out an IP address. And the last thing we need on our network is any more delays. Now, another thing that you can find on this Advanced tab would be right here where it says Change Server Connection Bindings. This is the exact same window that we just looked at a few minutes ago when we right-clicked on our server and selected it. And then we have DNS Dynamic Update Registration Credentials. This is where you can specify an actual user account which will be involved with DNS Dynamic Update. Now, this is something we haven't looked at yet. Let's go ahead and look at that now. On the DNS tab, you will see here that we have the ability, and I personally think this is really cool. This is something that was introduced back in Windows 2000, but this is where you can bring DHCP automation and DNS automation together. The real simple version of what this is basically as a client communicates with a DHCP server to get its IP address, the DHCP server could then go out to the DNS server and say, hey, DNS server, I just handed out this IP address to a client named such and such. Why don't you make a record in your database so name resolution can take place on that IP address? I think that's super cool because that just kind of automates everything from one central location. Now you'll see here that by default it is enabled. It will automatically update all DNS-A, which is what's known as a forward lookup record, and PTR, or pointer, which is known as a reverse lookup record. We'll get into more detail on that in the DNS video, but only if requested by DHCP clients. You could do that, or you could say no. Why don't you always do it, whether the client asks you to do it or not? Now, another neat thing, by default, is you'll notice the box is checked where it says to discard these records when the lease is deleted. If that lease were to expire or if the client were to actually release it back to the DHCP server, the DHCP server would go out to DNS and say, hey, you remember that record that I had you create for that client that I gave out that IP address? Well, you can go ahead and delete that record because that client doesn't have that IP address anymore. It's back with me. And then the last thing here, and this is something that was a really handy tool that we probably won't have to worry about much anymore, which is this box right here, which is dynamically update DNS records for clients that do not request updates. The example they give here would be a client running NT4. Some other examples might be clients running Windows 95 or 98. Any of the older clients that existed before we had dynamic DNS. Clients that wouldn't know how to dynamically update a DNS database. If you would like to have their records updated, you could do so by checking this box. Now again, because you have to go all the way back pre-Windows 2000, odds are that most of us are not going to have a circumstance with a network that has these clients with this requirement. Now the one other thing that I want to show you on this particular screen is this tab right here where it says Network Access Protection, or NAP. Now this is something we're going to get into in a later video. I just wanted to show you that this is where we can integrate NAP with DHCP and choose to enable or disable in this location. So don't worry about that for right now. We'll come back and revisit that later when we talk about network access protection in more detail. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of this screen. And there's one last thing that I want to show you, and that would be the performance counters. Now I'm going to go ahead and click on Start, Administrative Tools, and I'm going to go into something called the Reliability and Performance Monitor. In here, I'm going to click on Performance Monitor. Now this is a tool that again we're going to get into in a later video. We'll talk about exactly how you use this tool. But one of the things that we look at, and you can see a chart that's already starting to be formed here, is we look at performance counters. So I'm going to right click on the chart and select Add Counters. And one thing that I want you to see, and this is really the only thing I want you to pay attention to right now, is if I scroll up, you will notice that we have counters that are now available to us under DHCP server. We have the ability to look at pretty much a more detailed charting mechanism of a reporting mechanism of that statistics window that we were looking at a little while ago. Here we can look at the communication with the DHCP server and look at it on a timed basis. Now again, we're not going to get into the details on how to do this right now. I just wanted you to see that on a DHCP server, these counters will be added for you. If we were to look at this exact same utility on a non-DHCP server, you wouldn't see these entries. So these are just some of the common maintenance tasks that are involved with managing a DHCP server. Now, you may have noticed as I was clicking through the screens, there are other windows, there are other options out there. I just wanted to go ahead and show you the features that I felt would be most important for you to know right now. So, in this video, I've shown you some of the basic maintenance tasks that can be involved in the managing of a DHCP server. These included the adding and removing of network bindings, which is where we can control which networks a DHCP server will provide its services to. I showed you the default location of the DHCP database and how to move that database if necessary. Backup and recovery is something that takes place pretty much on an automated fashion by the DHCP server on a regular basis, but can be done manually if necessary. We can start and stop the DHCP service if need be. We took a look at a couple of groups that are present on a local DHCP server called the DHCP administrators and DHCP users, which we can use these to delegate out certain levels of administration if necessary. Took a look at some of the statistics that are available on both a basic level and then also on a performance counter level. Saw how to reconcile our scopes if we get inconsistencies between the registry and the database itself. Saw how to create audit logs. Talked about conflict detection, which is something that is really generally not necessary, but if so, we'll take a look at how to do it. And we saw that DHCP could be integrated with DNS and with NAP. Now, as I stated at the beginning of this video, most of these things, most of us will not have to do at all, or if at all, on a very, very minimal basis. But just in case, it's a good idea to have an understanding of how these things work. And I will also tell you that some of these extra options and windows that you may notice, by all means, feel free to research them if you feel it necessary to understand them. But for the most part, really not something that you should ever run into. And if you ever do, by all means, feel free to drop us a line if you need assistance on how to do additional functionality within your DHCP server. So that wraps up this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.